Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening to those joining us from the US, India, and elsewhere. Welcome to this panel hosted by the Young India Policy Forum. My name is Akriti Vasudeva, and I'm a Vice President of YIPF and a research analyst at the Stimson Center. So YIPF is a network of young professionals working on South Asian affairs in the United States. And we are delighted to welcome you to this timely discussion on US-India relations. Now, we've seen a flurry of activity in US-India relations in recent days and weeks. With the 2+2 ministerial dialogue last week, which included the signing of BECA, the last four of the foundational defense agreements, and improving interoperability between the United States and India. And this week, the US and India, along with Japan and Australia, will participate in the first Quad maritime exercise since the group's reinvigoration in 2017. And of course, tomorrow is election day here in the United States, the outcome of which will impact the trajectory of the US-India relationship. So we'll take this opportunity to reflect on the last 4 years of the US-India relationship, on the security, political, and economic aspects of it, and then assess what the next 4 years will bring. And joining me today is a fantastic set of speakers. Let me introduce them briefly. Pooja Bhatt is pursuing her PhD in diplomacy and disarmament from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And she has extensive experience working on maritime issues related to the Indo-Pacific. She just released her first book titled 9-Line, Deciphering the South China Sea Conundrum, which I said came out earlier this year. Akhil Bery is a South Asia analyst covering India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka for the Eurasia group. YIPF members are familiar with him as a founder and president of YIPF. And finally, Sriram Lakshman is the United States correspondent for The Hindu. The Hindu, as you know, is one of the leading English dailies in India. And he primarily covers politics in Washington, the India-US relationship, and the United Nations. So we'll start by hearing some opening remarks from each of our panelists for 5 minutes each. Then I'll use my moderator privilege to ask them a few questions. And finally, I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Please put your queries in the chat box. And for the sake of time, I'll bundle them up and pose that to our panelists at the end of our conversation. And finally, since it is a Monday morning before the election, and I know Akhil has to run away a little bit early, so I'll run a very tight ship and I'll ask our panelists to keep their responses brief. So Pooja, let me start with you and ask you to give us a broad sense of how US-India strategic relations have progressed under President Trump, particularly with regard to cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and ask you to give us a sense of how defense and security ties would evolve under a new administration. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, good morning everyone and good evening for everyone else. Thank you YIPF and Akriti for having me on this panel. Thank you. I'm really, it's a STEAM panel and I'm happy to be here. To start with the question that you have put up to me, we will all agree, all the US watchers would agree that in the past 2 decades or so, consecutive US administrations have shown unequivocal bipartisan support for India as its partner in Asia. And this was seen in continuation when Trump also became president of the United States. However, what has changed has been how US views Asia strategy and how India fits into its larger strategy towards the US, towards Asia. For example, if I can just go a little before President Trump, under President Obama, the vision of the US administration, for example, was redefined as pivot to Asia, and India became a major defense partner. And I think that did not change since then. So under President Trump, the vision for Asia became more acute in terms of Indo-Pacific, because from Asia-Pacific, now the focus had come to Indo-Pacific, which stands more for the maritime construct of Asia, for the reasons of free and unobstructed trade, sea line of communication, traditional security issues that had intensified during the same time, for example, North Korean nuclear program and so on and so forth. Therefore, what both national defense strategy and national security strategy of the US, which were consecutively released in 2017, 2018 in a month, it made it very clear to the world that the target of the US policy, Indo-Pacific policy under Trump administration was China, which was repeated there multiple times in both the documents. This is a crucial point because because Prime Minister Modi also had defined his own vision of Indo-Pacific, which hasn't been a country or threat specific. Instead, he called for inclusive Indo-Pacific that reflected their desire, not only in terms of to be more inclusive in terms of member parties, but also on the issues of cooperation. So, given this larger difference in vision between the two leaders, despite these differences, the two countries, I would say, in past 4 years did well in terms of upholding their relations and even upgrading their strategic relation. That is visible in the culmination of military cooperation agreements, BECA being the latest one, the legacy of 2+2 dialogues that has been continued and been doing quite well, the upgradation of Quad consultations from secretary level to foreign ministers level, and even a culmination of bilateral ties, which the comprehensive global strategic partnership, which started in 2013 during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's tenure, however, culminated earlier this year under when the President Trump visited India. So under President Trump, also Indo-Pacific strategy, India continues to be a major defense partner, and that has something remained consistent. Trade has been basically military sales, which is the major part, apart from conducting a lot of joint military exercises with India and the regional partners. So military has been a major focus in the Indo-Pacific strategy under President Trump. Besides this, India and US also share a common vision on terrorism, and Pakistan being one of the terror center focal point for these two administrations, and the consecutive statements have proven that. So in that sense, the two countries have shared a lot of commonality and vision in terms of their Indo-Pacific. However, there has been certain differences in their approaches towards Indo-Pacific, and that is important to highlight. First would be on China, and there is a difference in approach, I would say that. On one hand, President Trump's relation has taken, with respect to China, has taken full swing from, Rose Garden speech in 2015 to trade wars and coronavirus pandemic at South China Sea, war issues and so on in the recent years. So it has taken a full swing on the other side in terms of relation. However, India has been more subtle with China by undertaking constant dialogues, even in the most difficult times of bilateral relation, and for its best reasons. So, in other words, strategic relations with the US has flourished with or without China factor in the relationship, and I see it as a very good thing. On the other issue, which could have affected the strategic relation but did not, was the domestic issues, because the two administrations in the US and India, there has been a difference how they see Indian domestic issues on human rights and other domestic issues. And Indian leadership has consecutively shown its displeasure against American statements which were released on its domestic interests. Despite these hiccups, I think the two sides have learned to adopt the compartmentalization of issues of the times, and they're not trying to mix up different issues and trying to move ahead one by one on each of the issues. On the second part of it, if you see under new administration, there is unlikely to be a major diversion from the current Indo-Pacific strategy. Whichever candidate comes to power, there would be similar continuation of the strategy, strengthening of military partnership through military sales, joint military exercises. I think that will remain the focal point. However, if Joseph Biden comes to be the president, there would be a refocus on strengthening trade relations with the regional countries, and that was something overlooked by President Trump's leadership. Lastly, what I would want to mention is that what will continue to test American commitment in the region would be the roles that countries themselves in the Indo-Pacific want to play, and how US would want to then, remain engaged with these countries. And it is true for most of the Asian countries, but I will keep my comment focused to India. Indian leadership has shown its own ambition in the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific. And therefore, there has been a political and diplomatic proactiveness within Indian leadership regarding its role in the regional security architecture. And therefore, India is not falling into any camps, and it has been shown by several pronouncements. Therefore, the current Indo-US relationship, and as well as in the future, it will have to maneuver through these issues, compartmentalization of issues and consensus of issues. For example, Quad, and I've just finished my point with this. It is a good example to see where Quad has seemed to broaden its agenda from being perceived against a common threat to addressing issues of common challenges and looking for issues of cooperation, such as COVID that we recently saw in one of the talks. So from the looks of it, Indo-US relationship will continue to remain largely transactional and compartmentalized on issues, is how I see in the current and future administration as well.
Thanks, Pooja. And I'll come back to you a little bit maybe on the China factor in US-India relations, particularly as India's policy towards China seems to be changing in light of the border standoff. But let me come to Akhil now, since Pooja gave us a great segue into trade and economic issues. Akhil, I'll ask you to just talk about how US-India trade and economic relations have fared under President Trump. What have been some key challenges, and how you expect this aspect of the relationship to look like in a new administration?
Great, thanks, Akriti. So just as kind of a background, total US-India trade, according to the Census Bureau right now, last year it was $91 billion as compared to $74 billion in 2017. So there's been clear momentum on the US-India trade front. However, that has not, trade momentum has not come without trade tensions. And trade tensions are nothing new in the US-India relationship. US firms are constantly frustrated by the barriers to market entry that India puts up and regulatory changes that are made after major investment. So a prime example is Walmart's investment in Flipkart. It was one of the largest foreign direct investments made, yet soon after, Press Note 2 was issued. And for those who don't know, Press Note 2 basically what the government of India said clarified the rules. So while Walmart was given assurances that the rules would not be changed, the government changed the rules on them to say that Walmart branded products would no longer be able to be sold on Flipkart's platform. So that was a pretty major change. And there are a lot of other ongoing concerns over market access, including price controls on medical devices. That was a huge issue. Data localization measures are a trade issue that's going to come up in the future, especially as India kind of debates its data privacy law and kind of tries to understand what the definition of critical data is, personal data is, supercritical personal data is, and what data needs to be stored within India's borders. And also India's tariffs on electronic goods. Now, while those tariffs were ostensibly done to lower India's bilateral trade deficit with China, they were done in such a way that US products were actually caught in the crosshairs as well. And this has kind of been a theme under the Modi administration, is that trade has not been kind of a big agenda item for Modi. India has withdrawn from all of its bilateral investment treaties and produced a new model bilateral investment treaty, which is not considered to be investor friendly at all. Free trade negotiations with the EU and Canada have essentially stalled. Modi has made the dramatic decision to withdraw from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So as my old boss, Ambassador Tezzy Schaefer, likes to say, Modi is pro-investment but anti-trade. And that has definitely been the case with the relationship with the US, where trade tensions got to the point where India's benefits under the Generalized System of Preferences program, a zero tariff program, which India was the largest beneficiary of. The US suspended India's access to the GSP program, essentially graduating it because it felt that US companies were not getting fair and equitable market access. Now that meant medical device price controls, it meant more market access for US dairy products. US dairy has long sought access to the Indian market. This has been an issue that's been ongoing for over 20 years, and there really seems to be no end in sight to kind of concluding a negotiation on that. So what we've been seeing is that there have been multiple attempts at kind of getting a trade deal done. And I would hesitate to call it a trade deal. And what it seems like is that India would lower tariffs on some agricultural products, including nuts, almonds, fruits. India raised these tariffs in response to the US imposing Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs on steel exports from India. And India retaliated, which was within India's right to do so. But that set the basis for negotiations between the Trump administration and the government of India on kind of this bilateral trade package. However, despite kind of multiple false start, a crescendo of expectations. So at the UN General Assembly last year, at President Trump's visit this year, and even Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal saying all it'll take is a few phone calls between me and Bob Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, we will be able to get this done. However, it still has not been completed. And part of that is that the US negotiators feel that negotiating with India is kind of like pulling teeth out of one's head. It is a very painful and arduous process, whereas from the Indian perspective, they view it as the US constantly shifting the goalposts and constantly adding to the demands, because from the US perspective, this is perhaps the one and only opportunity to get some sort of trade deal with India, and then negotiations might not be what might take another 10, 15 years after that. So kind of looking forward, if President Trump comes back, there will be greater pressure to conclude the long-awaited trade deal. And that also comes to the fact that President Trump has empowered Bob Lighthizer and the office of the USTR in a way that we haven't seen before to go after kind of trade disputes with countries. It is, and as Dr. Ashley Tellis has pointed out, it's interesting that the trade negotiations have not overshadowed the broader bilateral relationship, as we've seen, for example, with China. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Biden administration, is that these trade tensions will be there. They have always existed and they will continue to exist. But in either Trump administration or Biden administration, access to the GSP program will be gone. I mean, there really is no going back to that. So the question is what is India negotiating for? And under a Biden administration, it is likely that we will see a less empowered USTR in favor of the broader strategic relationship with India. And so I think this is a very bipartisan relationship. It is one that's going to continue on the positive trajectory. I think trade tensions will be dialed down a bit. They will still exist, but they won't be as prominent an issue as kind of other broader strategic issues, including kind of the broader defense and military relationship. Let me pause there.
Thanks, Akhil. That was really comprehensive, and I'll come back to some of that friction, in trade and economic issues later in Q&A. But let me now turn to you, Sriram, and maybe let's zoom out a little bit and ask you to talk a little bit about the broader U.S.-India relationship and how that would look like in either case if President Trump or Vice President Biden wins. But particularly your thoughts on the role of the Indian diaspora and U.S.-India relations and how that's evolved. And, we've seen that you've done a lot of reporting on Indian American preferences. You just wrote a big piece for The Hindu on how, the Indian American vote has been quoted by both candidates and is likely to impact this hotly contested election. So give us a sense of that.
Thanks, Akriti, and thanks to everyone else at the Young India Policy Forum for inviting me to what's a very topical issue, the India-US bilateral relationship, especially in the context of the times we live in. These are important times, not just because there's, in two senses. One is there's a great deal of upheaval around the world, the likes of which many of us have not seen in our lifetimes. It's a protracted period of upheaval. And secondly, literally, it's an important time today on the eve of a very consequential election in the United States. And because it's consequential for the United States, it's consequential for the rest of the world. And to those of us joining the session from India, approximately 100 million Americans have already voted. That's an unprecedented number of early voting. The diaspora, the Indian American community, has around 4.16 million people, of which 1.9 million individuals are eligible to vote. And as Akriti suggested, Both sides have been quoting these votes this year. The Indian American community has, in a sense, found itself to be at one of the centers, at the core of this year's campaign on both sides of the aisle. And a key reason for this is the number of Indian Americans in several battleground states exceeded the margin of victory in some of those states in 2016. But that's not all. A record number of Indian American candidates are running for office at all levels, right from the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, to people running for office at the local city level, for instance. According to a partial list that's maintained by the Indian American Impact Fund, there are some 60 candidates running for state legislatures and the US Congress, plus several more who did not make it past the primaries. And this is not counting the many individuals who are running for local offices. So there's also a lot more movement on the funding front, millions of dollars. I don't have an exact number because that requires, a last name search and aggregating it using the FEC database. But what I do know is that there is a lot of movement, unprecedented movement on both the voter side as well as the candidate side and the funding side this election. Okay, so in some senses, Indian Americans have really arrived politically. I mean, they'd already established themselves in a number of different fields. But in politics, I think when we look back on 2020, we'll see a before and an after in terms of political engagement. So what do we know about the political preferences of this heterogeneous community? First is that a significant majority is planning to vote for Biden. Okay, this may not be news to people in the US, but people in India may be surprised because the impressions that you get colloquially or from like everyday narratives could be quite different. This conclusion is based on two recent surveys, one from September, which is the Asian American Voter Survey by Karthik Ramakrishnan and team of API Data, and the other is the Indian American Attitude Survey by Sumitra Badrinath, Milan Vaishnav, and Devesh Kapoor. So according to that, some 72% of Indian Americans plan to vote for Biden and 22% for Trump. Usually you find that 50-something percent consider themselves Democrats, maybe about 15% Republicans, and 20 to 25% independents. So the fact that almost 3/4 are planning to vote for Biden this year shows that independents are voting Democrat this year in the Indian American community. So we can come back to how, in the Trump campaign, what I noticed in my conversations was they're playing up the Trump-Modi connection. And on the Democrat side, they're talking about the Kamala Harris connection. And, Joe Biden has written a recent op-ed in India West where he's talking about his own India credentials. That's his answer to the Trump-Modi ad that was featured, a campaign ad that was featured by the Trump campaign. So we can come back to these two factors and how they're playing out. The other point I'd like to make about voting preferences is that in the relative scheme of things, Indian Americans are more concerned about the economy than healthcare, than racism, than taxes. The India-US relationship, and it's a little bit ironical that I'm saying this here, perhaps, but that ranks 11th in a set of 12 priorities for Indian Americans. And, people are more concerned about, can they get their medical bills paid? Can they put food on the table? And that's natural. That's the same. And that holds across countries, I believe. Foreign policy doesn't come at the top of the list. My guess is that older voters with more direct connections to India care more about the India-US relationship than those who have spent most of their lives here or who were born and raised here. So that brings me to the next point that I wanted to touch on today, the evolving role of the diaspora and the relationship. So I've been in this position for about 2 years, so I'm not going to pretend that I've been here for 10 years. And some of my views are based on the research I've done. People I've spoken, prominent names I've spoken to in the diaspora. The sense that I got was that the real coming of age again in terms of the US India relationship. We talked about the politics here in the US, but in terms of the US-India relationship, the diaspora really made its presence felt when the civil nuclear deal was signed. Okay, that's when it first started. And since then, you've seen a growth in the activism of the diaspora as far as the bilateral relationship was concerned. You know, in the Modi administration, you could see the impact of the organization of the diaspora when Modi visited the US. There was the Madison Square Garden event in 2014, San Jose 2015, and of course, most of you are familiar with the Howdy Modi event in Houston last year. Modi has had this model of organization in other countries as well. Canada, there was something in Wembley in London. And then when I was in Brussels once, when he had visited, he organized a similar event outside the capital. So why is this happening? And what's happening right now with the diaspora? So first you saw them getting involved with the civil nuclear deal. Then you saw them organizing. And I don't want to say everybody's organizing because, you know, I don't want to give the impression that this is a homogenous community. It's not, okay? It's polarized, just like India is polarized at the moment and the US is polarized at the moment. But just those, there were large numbers who came out to organize these events for Modi. Now, where the diaspora is, based on my conversations and what I've seen them doing, is they're not organizing around specific deals like a trade deal, a nuclear deal, or specific events, but they're more proactive. For example, they're thinking about inequality in the US. They're thinking about B2B cooperation between India and the US. How can you secure supply chains? These discussions are happening outside the government-to-government framework. And, you know, I think the fact that it's happening outside that framework makes it no less central to the bilateral relationship. And in fact, this reinforces the relationship. That's where, you know, the relationship really happens. Through these business-to-business ties, through these people-to-people ties. So I think my fellow panelists have addressed specific aspects of the bilateral relationship. Pooja talked about security cooperation, and Akhil did a deep dive into trade. I'd like to take a step back and look at the direction of the relationship. And as my fellow panelists have suggested, no matter who wins the election, I think the relationship is going to overall get stronger. That's my sense. Okay, you'll have, under a Trump 2.0, there'll be one set of challenges and opportunities. And under Biden, there'll be another set of challenges and opportunities. But with broad bipartisan support in the US, and with the fact that both the NDA and the UPA governments in India, both of these governments had achievements to their name with regard to the bilateral relationship, I think it's fair to say that each government in India and each government in the United States is likely to progress the relationship so it becomes stronger. There will be challenges, but there will also be plenty of opportunities. Overall, I think the picture is looking very good, I'd say. Thanks, Akhil.
Thank you so much, Sriram. And I will invite questions in the chat. Anyone who wants to ask anything to our panelists, please put it in the chat. But before I do that, I do have some follow-up questions for each of you. So Sriram, I wanted to pick up on the point of sort of focus on domestic policy versus foreign policy. In the United States, there has been some concerns from some analysts that because of obviously the coronavirus pandemic is still raging in the United States, there are high unemployment levels, there is the issue of polarization and racial division in the country, and that whoever wins, is going to be internally focused for a long period of time because of the number of domestic issues in the US at the moment. So how much of a priority will the US-India relationship be, or how much of a focus will foreign policy be when there are so many domestic issues to deal with within the US in the next 4 years?
Thanks, Akriti. So a couple of questions. The State Department and the Defense Department and the machinery of the United States government has its own momentum and inertia. So to some extent, regardless of what's happening, say, in the White House, at the top level, you're certainly right, there's not going to be a visit by Biden or Trump to India again anytime soon. And, we're going to find an internal focus at the highest level. But this machinery runs on its own momentum. So the day-to-day issues of the relationship, that bilateral relationship, it'll continue to be oiled. Things will go forth. There's scheduled 2+2 meetings, there's scheduled Quad meetings. These are going to continue. And that's what's keeping enough to to keep this relationship going until the next mini crisis hits, such as what are we going to do to get past this trade impasse that we find ourselves at, for example. So yes, there will be an internal focus, but there's also enough momentum in the government to continue the relationship. You're probably not going to, I think you're right, we're probably not going to see some huge headline achievements in the relationship, at least for the first 6 months. So I'd say to the end of the summer next year, maybe.
Thanks, Sriram. Pooja, I wanted to follow up on, like I said, the China factor in U.S.-India relations. You spoke about the frenetic pace in the U.S.-India defense and security cooperation, whether that's BECA or cooperation within the Quad. And I'd argue that some of this is attributable to India's deteriorating relations with China. And we've seen that India's traditionally been hesitant to undertake certain kinds of actions, whether that's joint naval patrols with the United States or really anything in the South China Sea. So, as India considers ways of pushing back against China, should we expect to see some of that change? Should we expect to see India shed some of that reluctance, particularly in the maritime domain?
Yeah, great question. Actually, I keep thinking about the same question time and again myself. But if you see the trajectory of India-US strategic relationships, if we talk about, despite the China factor, whether China has been a threat at the immediate point or not, I think the talks and the cooperation has continued since then. So if we, in the past 2-3 years, yes, the India-China rivalry has just became worse, I think. And if you see from that vantage point, we can definitely value India-US relationship from that angle, that US has been supporting India. But you have to consider this as well, that India has never spoken, has not been ever vocal about China and taking any help from outside. That has never been there. They have never been vocal, even when there were, a lot of arguments were coming up that India will seek US help and they should go overtly and ask for US. I don't think that ever happened. So I think there's a desire in Indian administration to keep their engagement with the US irrespective of their China relationship, because as soon as you try and see India-US relationship just from the China angle, I think a lot of things changes. And I think that's not good for the relationship in the longer run. And I think that wisdom has prevailed of administrations after administration. So no matter from which angle you see, I think India-US relationship has sustained and grown despite China being a threat. And even South China Sea, if you recently see, the cooperation goes on. The Indian Ocean, the cooperation goes on. And, this is in front of our eyes in terms of the agreements that have gone, even in these times. So, yeah, I believe that I don't see it from China angle. I think India-US relationship are more than the China angle. And I think that's a good thing for the relationship.
Thanks, Pooja. Akhil, I wanted to ask you about the conversation that's happening now in the US about wanting to move production out of China after the whole coronavirus pandemic, and wanting to have more resilient supply chains. And there's been some conversation about looking at India as an option of trying to move some of that production there. Obviously we've seen a lot of it is moved to Vietnam. But what are some challenges that US companies are dealing with regard to wanting to move that production to India? We know there's been challenges with regard to availability of land or reliable electricity or taxation policy. So can you speak to that a little bit and how that's going and how that will look like in a new administration?
Sure. One of the big challenges that India has faced is going back to the anti-trade narrative. I think it was on a Grand Tamasha podcast between Milind and Ashley Tillis, where Ashley spoke about how India views its path to growth as imposing imposing tariffs like the U.S. did in the early 1900s, build up domestic industry, and then open up for foreign investment. Unfortunately, the world has changed. Globalization is the name of the game now, and India is not inserting itself into the global supply chain. So as we've kind of seen with this Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign, while ministers have kind of talked about a more confident and more outward-looking India, in reality, that has tended to mean more protectionism. And it's been difficult for companies to kind of import products into India, kind of assemble them, and then export it out. There is infrastructure is improving, but there are still issues there. Tensions between the federal and state governments over regulatory policy also plays a role. I mean, like, look at the recent agricultural reforms. You've already got Punjab saying that they will pass laws to overturn the policies passed by the central government. Going back to what happened with Walmart, when the whole multi-brand retail debate was happening in India in the first part of the 2010s, it left it up to the state. The central government couldn't bring enough states on board, so it left it up to the state governments to decide whether or not to kind of go ahead with implementation of increasing FDI and multi-brand retail. So Delhi, which was originally ruled by a Congress government, went ahead and did that. But then as soon as the Aam Aadmi Party came into power in Delhi, they overturned that decision. And so kind of you've got that policy uncertainty that continues to hang over international businesses' heads. You've got the taxation concerns. I mean, look at the Vodafone case right now. India has continuously challenged Vodafone on the idea of retroactive taxation, has lost the appeal, and is now planning to kind of appeal the loss. And kind of the idea of this retroactive taxation continues to hang like the sword of Damocles over the head of international investors because they don't know when the policy might change. And also there's a tendency of the government of India to introduce policy to allow policy and regulatory changes to be distributed for comment on a Friday afternoon, give you 1 week for comment, which is not how any multinational company works. And then, I mean, like you do have the kind of like going to TikTok, for example, from a geopolitical standpoint, that might have been a good thing. But when you kind of fit it into the narrative of India not being a stable regulatory environment, that's a great example, is that TikTok, ByteDance had already made a significant amount of investment in India, and then the regulations were changed on it. So until you kind of see this policy certainty, until you see more kind of tariff reductions and a move away from protectionism and an embracing of trade and also protection of investor rights, that's a big thing. Is I mentioned before about the bilateral investment treaties and most favored nation status. Until you kind of see those trends in that direction, it'll be tough for foreign investors to kind of look at India. Now, I'm not saying there won't be foreign investment. There will be foreign investment because India is a growing market. It is one of the last untapped markets. And there are going to be performance linked incentive schemes, as we've seen in the electronics sector. But until you kind of have a more stable policy environment and less friction between the central and the state governments, I think India is going to miss the wave on kind of the supply chain relocation.
Thanks, Akhil. I definitely have a lot of follow-ups to that, but I will let some of our YIPF members ask the questions that they have for you. Aman, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Sure. Thank you, Akriti. And yeah, I mean, I think this can go to all three of the panelists, but Akriti, I leave it to you because I know time is an issue. Basically, this question is the favorite Washington, D.C. parlor game, which is on S-400 and the implications that will have. I think my question is, not just on the change in the White House, but how any congressional shifts that take place in this election. Obviously, House and Senate races can shift the dynamics, particularly in the Senate, shifting it completely to the Democrats. That's been an aim for them. And, the outlooks that they have both on Russia and on India. Just wanted to ask a question on how all of the panelists see the S-400 issue playing out, not just under a shift in the White House, but also in Congress, and what implications major shifts in sort of control we'll have on that issue.
Sriram, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, this is a tricky one. I definitely do think, when we talk about the elections, especially outside the United States, nobody focuses on the Congress. It's all about the White House. And, if you've got Trump in the White House after this month and continuing for another 4 years, and the Senate goes to the Democrats, I think we'll all agree that, well, maybe we'll all agree that the House will stay with the Democrats, then, there's going to have to be compromise. And it's not something Trump does well. At the same time, I do think Aman's point about there being a shift in the S-400 policy, for example, Congress is going to be looking at it in a lot, was probably going to take a harder line if the Senate goes to the Democrats as well. It's hard to say what the final outcome will be, but I imagine that there will be some kind of negotiation between, say, Biden, if that happens, and the Congress, and they'll have to weigh what it means for the U.S.-China relationship, driving India away. They might find other ways to get around it that look like they're punishing India or sanctioning India in some sense, but I guess I don't have an answer to how it's going to turn out, but it's going to be messy, and there will be negotiations between the White House and the Congress if it comes to that.
So one thing to add to that, I think I would take a look at the Turkey case study, because Trump has not been kind of eager to impose sanctions on Turkey despite being legally required to under CAATSA. And Erdogan seems to be pushing the button much, much further than India is. So Congress is kind of out for blood there, especially as Erdogan has taken a much more liberal turn. So could that offset kind of tensions with India to show that CAATSA is working? Perhaps, but I think Turkey will be a good case study for how the administration would deal with India.
So Kyle, I'll ask you to ask your question next, because I know Akhil has to leave in a few minutes and he might have something to say on that.
Sure. Yeah. So I was I listened in on the 2+2 with the U.S. India Business Council this morning, and Ambassador Ken Juster, and I was and a number of things kind of struck me about the conversation. One was the sort of forcefulness with which Ambassador Juster really sort of insisted that for all things strategic, commercial, diplomatic, that it really did appear to him like the ball was in India's court in terms of next steps. This was certainly true of things like Akhil had mentioned earlier about the uncertain regulatory issues that are making things tougher for foreign business in India, but also in terms of some of the strategic next steps, and particularly kind of casting doubt on the ability of India to maintain strategic autonomy. And he had a line where he said, and I'm sure he's repeated this, I'm sure he's said this before, but he had a line basically saying, in the emerging kind of global order, it's nice to have a lot of friends, but it's better to have a few good friends when the chips are on the table. And so I guess I'd be curious to hear really from any of you if there was, if you have a sense that there may be some cracks, even sort of privately in the veneer of strategic autonomy. I mean, I know that Minister Jaishankar is really sort of proudly flying that flag these days, but I'd be curious to see, if there are other glimmers that maybe suggest that India might be responsive to that, or whether that was just sort of Juster pleading for closer strategic ties.
Sriram,
can I jump in, Akriti? Yeah. I mean, to Kyle's point, I think that the US and India are going to cooperate more and more. because of what's happening with China, regardless of what ministers say officially. But at the same time, as another panelist, I was on another panel recently, and one strategic thinker pointed out the US isn't actually offering India an alliance. I mean, a lot of us are talking about alliances, but the US hasn't offered India an alliance. So I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in that sense. There is Quad cooperation, and now we have the Malabar exercises. But the Quad is also at this moment, based on my understanding, looking for ways to expand beyond security and military cooperation to talk more about, the pandemic, for example. That's where they're cooperating. But yes, I do think the US and India are going to cooperate more and more. Call it what you want, but that will happen.
I will say, Kara, I feel like it's a little bit strange to hear the statement now, coming as it does after the 2+2, after the signing of BECA, after India inviting Australia to the Malabar. It seems like a lot of the boxes that needed to be ticked over the last few years in terms of India's seriousness towards dealing with China or cooperating with the US have already been done in the last few days and months. And so it seems a bit strange that this statement should come now. Pooja, do you have any thoughts to add on the sort of strategic autonomy, and is that going away or not?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Basically, I think the US administration started with the either or binary, either you are with us or you're not with us. That's how the relationship started. Whereas India showed that it's not interested in taking those binaries and it has its strategic autonomy to look after. However, in coming days, what we have seen is both the countries are actually, converging in their interest and, going beyond their strict limits and, signing of these lines. So I think a lot of changes have been seen, as you just mentioned, that a lot have been achieved in the last few days that could have achieved in some of these years, actually. So I think a strategic autonomy, as you've been, the previous panelist also has been talking about, India has, I think, come to take it really more seriously and being overt about it. And, even the S-400 issue is the same, I think, how Turkey has done about it, that even if there was a fear of US imposing its sanction, it was in the end Turkey who had, finally rule the game. And that's what exactly I was talking about. It's how the countries within Asia, if we just talk about Asia, Indo-Pacific countries will decide how they will negotiate with the US. And I think then US will, with each of these countries, will devise its own ways of negotiating. And this is something, I think that this trend is something we're going to see in the coming years as well. That starting from the either or binaries, we'll be moving towards more, bilateral, one-to-one, mixing and matching of strategies and, going ahead with the cooperation. And that's going to be the trend.
Thanks, Pooja. Akhil, I know you have to head out, so thank you so much for joining us. Good luck. See you soon.
Sorry for having to drop early. We've got an internal call. So Sriram and Pooja, it's great to be on a panel with you. I hope to see you guys in person soon.
Thanks, Akhil. We still have a few more questions for both of you, Sriram and Pooja. So Sylvia, do you want to go ahead? I think your question will be great for Sriram and Pooja.
Hi, Sriram and Pooja, great presentations. Quickly, we spoke a lot about some of the developments which are on the positive side of the ledger when it comes to India-US relations, which is great. And I completely agree with you, like there's a lot of momentum between fostering bilateral ties. I'm trying to understand, do you anticipate some black swan events or things that might disrupt the ongoing momentum? And especially when I say this, I mean like, how is India situating itself or possibly, working, thinking if there is a Trump administration, clearly there's going to be tightening of immigration policies. So how is India thinking about that? And also, I think, Pooja, you rightly mentioned there's a distinct difference between India's approach and the US's approach towards China in the Indo-Pacific. So how might there be any conciliation, if there is a Trump administration back in government, we think that the direction of US-China relationships is probably going to be more adversarial. So how does India situate in such circumstances? I'll stop there.
Should I be going first?
Sure, go ahead, Pooja.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my presentation also, that there has been a lot of compartmentalization of issues. And as I've already mentioned, India has clearly made sure that the domestic issues are not impinging on its foreign policy issues, and H1B even visas being there, visa issues, human rights issues being there, trade issues being there. But however, these issues are not impinging upon each other, and then I think this is something again that will continue. And India has clearly made it a point time and again that even after they had a verbal spat-fire between a lot of times between ambassadors, between ministers, none of this has actually impinged on their relationship, and this will continue. I think the same is the issue with Indo-Pacific, where we can see the US-China relationship going worse in the times ahead. India, however, will continue its relationship with the US on a strategic level. It will not fall into any camp business, which has and again, I think I would appreciate on the US part as well that it has also not shown any hard and fast rule that you have to be in a camp business to be in a strategic relationship. And in fact, they have enlarged both the Quad and Indo-Pacific concept, and taken up a lot of new ideas and working with India. So that would be my answer to this. Even if there are issues on one front, it would not affect on the other front, and the relationship will remain transactional like this.
Sriram, on the immigration side, maybe?
Yeah, I think, Sylvia, if at least Trump and the Trump administration say that they're going to move towards more skill-based immigration, and they're going to sort the jobs by salary and then ensure that only at the highest level you have people coming from abroad. But then what they actually do and what they say, there might be a gap between that, and it's very hard to get into the president's mind. It's less hard to get into Stephen Miller's mind, which direction he wants things to go in. He'd rather shut the country off. I think it's not unfair to say that to immigration from, say, India, for instance, or really tighten it. But the extent to which India is worrying about that, and based on my sense here in DC, I don't think they're worrying about it too much. At the end of the day, these are individuals who immigrate to the United States, and they're not really your core vote bank like in the United States. So in India, politics is local. Domestic policy is driving everything, and that's what's driving votes, and that's what's informing foreign policy. I know your question was on Trump, and I agree with what Pooja said. India's learned that the conversations I had here over the last couple of years, they've learned how to keep Trump sweet. Okay, they know how to work with him. They're watching how other countries interact with Trump. At least that's what happened in Trump 1.0 and 2.0. It's going to be that much easier. But also think about, how is Trump going to be any different? I don't know the answer to this question. He has, assuming there's no change and we continue with a two-term presidency, what's he fighting for in the second term? Is he going to change, or his actions going to change? That's something to look at. I know you didn't ask about Biden, but I just want to use this opportunity to say, I don't think if Biden comes back to, if Biden wins, we're not going to go back to Obama Biden. Okay, the needle has moved on that. Again, where the policy is going to be driven by what works for the person in Scranton, not in Park Avenue, to use one of the phrases that camp has been using. And I'm not so sure that it's all going to be hunky-dory on the trade and immigration front. At least it's not going to go back to Obama type policies, although Biden has also talked about skilled immigration. We'll have to see where things go, either with Trump 2.0 or Biden 1.0.
Thanks both. And Arjun, I'll let you quickly ask the last question of our session.
Thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with us. So my question is actually following on Pooja's comments on the salience of China. So I was curious, if we put aside the core strategic concerns, China, Asia, Indo-Pacific, Quad, we put aside COVID, if we put aside the commercial and trade considerations we spoke about, is there scope for a lot of attention on the other stuff beyond the headlines, right? Obviously, if the Democrats come in, we're looking at climate change. But beyond that, are we talking about the Middle East, energy, naval presence? Are we talking about Iran, Afghanistan, development cooperation in maybe South Asia, Africa, multilateral institutions, global governance and commons? Is there any attention or scope for those types of things, or are those really bottom of the list? Thank you.
So if I get the question correct, you said, you've asked that if China is not there, is there a scope for US and India to have their relationship going on other fronts?
I think if we put aside the China question, if we put, because that's sort of the elephant in the room, if we put that aside, is there scope for all of this other stuff, or is there not much oxygen left?
Okay, interesting. Because I think if China is not there, I'm not sure how much India would be important for US then. I'm not sure. But for India, of course, there are a lot of issues where India would seek support from the US, UN SC membership being one of them, and representation and other multilateral organizations. I think there are a lot of areas to have their cooperation, and I think both the countries are going ahead. That's what exactly I meant, that the relationship of these two countries have continued and flourished despite China being in the room. And and this is across the all the areas of cooperation. If you see, not just strategic, but trade and multilateralism and human rights issues. They have their own differences, but they have come across to cooperate in wherever there are issues of dissonance as well. So as you correctly asked, without China factor, I think there are a lot of avenues India would seek US support. I'm not sure how much without China US would want India in this entire region. What role US would be seeking for India in that case would be something to ponder.
Thank you.
Sriram, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I do agree with Pooja, except I want to say, China was not such a big factor some years ago, but yet you saw this upward trajectory in the relationship. So that's where I'm taking my cues from. I think there's a natural logic to the US-India relationship. But I agree with Pooja that right now, the paradigm we exist in is China, 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 okay? And I think add to that, Mr. Trump is seen as, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, transactional, and therefore China plays an even bigger role. We might see a dampening down of that on the Democrat side, but on the whole, I do think there is cooperation. And as Pooja said, the immediate question is still the pandemic. And I think in India and the US, whatever is happening domestically in the US, however the US has handled its own coronavirus response within the country, internationally, India and the US have cooperated. Yes, there was a nudge for paracetamol and some comments, but that happened, and there has been cooperation on vaccines. That's going to happen. WHO, WTO, also the UN. What is Trump going to do about the UN? I mean, Trump 1.0 looked at WHO and WTO. I think we're going to see more possibly changes from the Trump administration towards the UN if Trump comes back to power. And, that could create more space for India when you're working with a disruptor, and I don't say that in a positive or negative sense, that could also bring opportunities, and they will have to think about that. But, I think, yes, if in a Trump administration, I think China will drive a lot of the policy towards India, as Pooja said.
Thank you.
Thanks to you both. Arjun, I'll just say that I agree with Sriram and Pooja that China is going to be sort of the driver or the aspect that's providing momentum to the US-India relationship, but I do think it's broader than that. I think we've seen that before with both sides wanting to define the relationship outside of China based on common values, based on working on, say, climate change, even in the Biden-Obama administration, working on renewable energy, working on education, working on technology. So I think there is actually a lot that the two sides can do besides obviously cooperation with regard to balancing China, but that's sort of the main factor that's driving the relationship now. But I want to thank everyone for being here today. I know it's a Monday morning, it's the day before the election. Sriram, particularly thanks to you. I know you were on deadline, and thank you so much for making it. Pooja, thank you. This was a really interesting discussion. I think things to watch for in the new administration would be, we know that there's going to be a strengthening of the US-India relationship, but probably some friction on trade, maybe some issues with, Huawei 5G data localization that we should be watching for, how things will evolve on climate change, but lots to look forward to. Thanks again. YIPF is really proud to host this discussion. We will post a video of this on our Twitter channel, which is YIPFDC. And if anyone is interested in being part of YIPFDC, please email us at yipfdc@gmail.com, and have a good day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.